Hello, and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking to Emma Stern, a licensed professional counselor and trauma-informed yoga teacher. We chat to Emma about the books Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Tawwab and The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo.
In Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself, licensed counselor and relationship expert Nedra Tawwab presents simple yet powerful ways to establish healthy boundaries in all aspects of life.
Our second book has been called one of the most influential books of the decade. The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo takes tidying to a whole new level, promising that if you properly simplify and organize your home once, you'll never have to do it again. Are our lives now boundaried and clutter-free? You'll have to listen on to find out.
Hi, Emma. Thank you for joining us on Books from Your Therapist.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here with you too. Thanks for having me.
Can you start out just sharing with our listeners just a little bit more about yourself? Who are you? Such a deep question, but just anything you would like to share in terms of parts of your identity, pronouns, your license, where you're working, any of that.
Yeah, so I'll give you sort of the surface level details. My name is Emma Stern. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white, straight, cis woman, and I work as an LPC. I'm a somatic therapist, licensed in Oregon, and I also have a history working with trauma-informed yoga, which we won't speak about so much today, but it is a big part of my identity that's led me into working as a therapist.
Which leads me into our next question, sort of what inspired you to become a therapist?
Yeah, great question. And I wish there was a really direct answer, but my journey was not direct. So I always knew I wanted to do sort of mission-driven work. And out of college, I did international work, and then I was working in nonprofits. And unfortunately, it just wasn't sustainable for me. I'm not sure if this was where I was in my life journey, and a lack of boundaries. Ironic, given that's what we're talking about today. Also, so many other factors: hustle culture of the 2000s, nonprofit industrial complex. Regardless, it wasn't sustainable. It was really hard for me to have a manageable work-life balance. So I left working in nonprofits to teach yoga full time. It's something I'd always been doing. Yoga was a huge part of my life. It was sort of a natural segue, and this job isn't working. I can make this other job bigger. And I love teaching yoga. I love doing it full time. Unfortunately, it wasn't something that was going to be super financially sustainable for the long term. But I did have the luck of having a therapist in my community who encouraged me to look at somatic therapy. And I started thinking about things like, how do I want to feel in a job? And it seemed to combine the right elements, like work that has a heart, somatics, which is something I'm deeply passionate about, deeply believe in, and then that flexibility to work for myself and be able to create my own work-life balance. So I'm lucky it worked. I really like being a therapist.
I was wondering if you could explain what a somatic therapist is, just sort of in an overall broad way for those that might not be aware.
Absolutely. The word soma comes from, I'm forgetting if it's Greek or Latin, but it is the Greek or Latin root word for body. So the idea of a somatic practice is basically something that integrates mind and body awareness. So it's a really broad term. This can refer to practices like yoga, meditation, tai chi. And when we take it into the therapy landscape, it's looking at your body, looking at your physical responses, where emotion lands in your body. Our feelings, right? They're literally feelings. So kind of unpacking what that is. And using that in how we work with the healing process. So it's going to look different for every somatic therapist. I have a yoga and mindfulness background, so that shows up a lot, and a lot of work around understanding nervous system and nervous system regulation. And with that, there's so many other ways in which somatic therapy can unfold. A little taste of it, but definitely I didn't fully answer your question.
No, thank you. I'm learning, so that was very helpful.
I don't think it's necessarily something I can fully answer because it varies so much from therapist to therapist, client to client.
We've had a few other somatic therapists on the podcast. My basis of how I work is also somatic, right? And that's actually how Em and I know each other. And so I think it's a fun question to ask because there might be similar flavors, but everyone works with it so differently. I think, especially now that the therapy landscape has changed quite a bit with COVID and people moving online and figuring out how to do that work either remotely or in person or a combo of both. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work as a therapist currently and maybe like who you're working with and where you're working?
Absolutely. So I am in private practice in Oregon. So I offer telehealth therapy to Oregon-based clients. My primary modality as a therapist is somatic and mindfulness based. Like all therapists, I'm influenced by sprinkles of other modalities, psychodynamic work, which looks at history and family themes and a lot of our stuff, resistance, defense mechanisms, those kind of things. And even a little CBT, not something I necessarily expected in grad school, but looking at behaviors, thought patterns, and how those have real big impacts, feelings on our lived experience. And the populations I work with, I would say the populations are pretty diverse, but the clinical focus is consistent. I work with adults who have a background of either traumatic or dysfunctional experiences in childhood. So clinically, a lot of my work is around trauma, anxiety, depression, but kind of looking at how those factors impact folks in their journey.
And what is it that you enjoy most about the work that you're doing? Has there been anything that's really surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that surprised me, which I'm happy to announce, is that I really love being a therapist. For anyone who's gone to a therapy grad school program, it is daunting, it is draining, and it's kind of a giant leap of faith. You learn all of these things and don't actually get to try them out until your third year or so when you're put in the hardest placements. So I definitely had a lot of fear of like my path, my decision. But now that I am on my own in private practice, and I've had some new experiences as a therapist since grad school, I love it. And kind of segueing with that, the second thing that surprised me is that my work inspires me more than it exhausts me. I think so often we think of therapists as burnt out, exhausted, drained, cynical. And, I know there is a very real aspect that can happen over time. It's hard work, and we're looking at traumatic content and hard things that have happened to people. But I would say, at least at this point in my journey, it inspires and excites me. It is so cool to watch people change their lives and find the courage to look at vulnerable material, try out new tools, learn to find connection with body, capacity with discomfort. So I love it. It's really inspiring work.
Oh, I just love hearing that. It's so nice to hear how excited you are about the work and where you're at with it in your own sort of like body and mind, and the boundaries you've put in place to be able to reach that place feels just so exciting to hear, because I think for those of you that don't know the process of getting licensed as a therapist, it is a very long one. And as Emma spoke to, you a lot of times end up doing your first work in some of the hardest places with some of the most like traumatized populations. And it can be, you're kind of thrown in there sometimes. And so it's always nice to hear where people are at within their own practice, like their actual practice and their practice as a therapist. So I appreciate you sharing that. It's so nice to hear where you're at with it emotionally, spiritually, etc.
Thank you. Well, you've seen me through the journey, so, so that feels extra sweet coming from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's nice that you guys get to pick and choose the areas that you kind of bring in, like the somatic and things like that. But that must also be daunting when you're trying to get your footing at the start. You're like, which one really works for me? So that's really great to hear that you're like enjoying it even more than you thought you would. Is there anything else that you'd like to share personally or professionally before we get started?
Yeah, I think just that I'm really looking forward to talking about these two books with each of you. I think they both are deeply somatic, and I think they both also discuss boundaries, which I find to be like one of the most necessary discussions in our clinical work. I was excited to pair these together. It's kind of it might seem like a funny pairing at first glance, but it really made sense to me in my body, perhaps because I was listening to both audiobooks at the same time as I was tidying up my house. But hopefully that connection will carry over.
Yeah, I appreciate you stating that because when you and I had been talking about what books you wanted to talk about, when you said we had started with Set Boundaries, Find Peace, and then you brought in the Marie Kondo book, and I was like, I couldn't put it to words either, but my body was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like there's something that fits here. So thanks for naming that piece there. And yeah, let's get started with our first book pick, which is Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Glover Tawwab. First of all, let's just talk straight boundaries before we jump into the book, because I think there's just so much dialogue around boundaries these days. Can you share how this book defines boundaries and why it's important for people to learn about boundaries?
Absolutely. So Nedra Tawwab describes boundaries as expectations and needs that help you feel safe and comfortable in relationships. So I like the way that this definition is framed, and I also think there's still more we could add to it. But I really like the way boundaries were explored in this book because it talks about boundaries not only interpersonally, but also within the way we behave, whether it's maintaining our own boundaries, but also kind of create boundaries with ourselves, so to speak. And I think that is so important. I would say that boundaries are a universal theme that shows up clinically, regardless of the client, regardless of what brings them into therapy. If we're thinking that most people come into therapy because they want to change something, right? Whether it's something currently happening in their life, whether it's relationship with the past, whether it's their relationships, there's a need for change. And I like to think of boundary blocks as the building blocks to creating these changes. So I think regardless of, diagnosis, presenting problem, whatever it may be, this is a theme that almost always shows up. And it's also something that we sort of lack common language around, even though it's out there in pop culture. I don't think a lot of us really know what we're navigating with boundaries. I loved this text because it was just very direct, these are things you can do, these are things that might happen, and just really transparent and kind of setting expectations around the process.
I appreciate you stating the self-responsibility piece. I think that's huge and important to sort of talk about. On that note, like what do you see people getting wrong about the discourse around boundaries? Like you mentioned, we hear a lot about it in pop culture, which is so true, but I'm curious if you notice anything around that discourse.
So there were two things that really, to me, stand out in particularly that I feel like is missing from the discourse. First, I don't think we discuss the discomfort in setting and maintaining boundaries. It is really hard to feel that discomfort in your body, the feelings we feel when we're worried about letting someone down. It's a somatic practice. I think a lot of our work around boundaries is learning how to manage discomfort, learning how to find relative peace in that discomfort. And I think the more we discuss boundaries as a process that's very uncomfortable, the more we'll also be discussing how we work with that discomfort. I think that piece is super important and not something that always gets translated in, like an Instagram meme. And second, I think our culture does not discuss boundaries with enough empathy. Empathy for both how hard it is to set boundaries, how hard it can be to receive boundaries, and the period of time when we're adjusting to new boundaries. They're not talking about this to me I think creates this idea that boundaries are punishments or ultimatums that must immediately be enacted. And our bodies and nervous systems don't work that way, right? We need time to make change, time to feel change and feel comfortable in it. I also think this leads people to being more scared of what it means to set boundaries. Because again, if we're not looking at it empathetically, we're like thinking, oh, I'm so mean to need this boundary. There's so much shame. There's something so wrong with me because I need the boundary. Or vice versa on the receiving end. Oh, I'm a terrible friend and I'm going to go run away and never talk or think about this again. Like that discomfort, I think part of it's just the somatic discomfort of like, this is hard, but also when we're like disconnected from that sort of empathy, it makes this process something that doesn't feel good. So I think the more we discuss all aspects of this process empathetically, the easier it is to approach this work.
The empathy piece is so great to name because I think sometimes when I hear boundaries being talked about in a greater sense, it feels so non-human, right? Like say this and
Totally.
then this happens,
Yeah.
or say this and then this might be the response. And it is uncomfortable, right? And a lot of times, I think it's talked about in the book, expect to feel guilt, right? And that's okay. So yeah, I appreciate the piece of like inviting in the softness around it because sometimes it does feel very clinical or just non-human or hard to actually implement some of these things. Can you talk a little bit about like the positive outcomes that occur when boundaries are created?
The author discusses symptoms commonly associated with not having boundaries. And some of the things she includes are overwhelm, resentment, avoidance, passive aggressive behavior, fantasies of running away, and no time for self care. And to me, just on a logical standpoint, it's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. If you're not able to create boundaries and you're doing things you don't want to do, you're going to feel resentful. You're going to feel overwhelmed. You might act avoidantly because you don't want to be in that situation. These aren't good feelings. And a lot of times these are feelings that lead people to therapy. So if we can get past that discomfort of setting boundaries, we're going to be mitigating these symptoms. So maybe we don't have to be passive aggressive because we can just be direct. We don't have to be avoidant because we're creating safety to have these conversations. I think more often than not, and there will always be outliers and exceptions, but more often than not, in my personal experience, boundaries have made relationships stronger. There's more trust in, oh, I can name this changing need I have. Our needs are always changing. And right now I need more personal space. And when that can be respected, I'm going to feel stronger, more trust, more closeness with that person. So yes, there's always a risk that things may not be well received. I know for me, the very few times I've had boundaries not well received, it's been something that after a period of grief, I feel a little relief, like, oh, maybe that wasn't a compatible relationship.
Since we've sort of started leading and touching on the book itself, I'm curious who would benefit from reading this book? And then on the opposite sort of side of that, who is this not for?
So I'm going to start with who this isn't for, because that feels like a more specific list. If there are any safety concerns, this is not the book. You need more specialized looks at what you are experiencing. So whether that's, I would say therapy, with any book, I think if you are experiencing safety concerns, you want that human element of support, not just a book that doesn't know your personal experience. But I guess with that, the themes that might fall under that are any sort of interpersonal abuse, any situation where there's dynamics of manipulation and control, and potentially situations where there's substance abuse and you want to navigate best practices and creating boundaries when there is this extra player in the picture.
Such an important disclaimer, right? For folks that are either noticing any heightened triggers while reading this book or in any sort of relationship that is unsafe to practice any of this. So thanks for sharing that.
I'm sure it's not an exclusive list. Those are, the first things that came to mind. But I think in trusting our own wisdom, right, in our own bodies, if you're reading this book and you're feeling like, whoa, that doesn't feel safe, trust your instinct.
And then who do you think that this book is for?
Anyone not in those situations, I think it's
Okay.
incredible. And like anything, I looked at the Goodreads for this page because I was kind of curious. I
Hmm.
loved it. I've been searching for what I would consider to be a more trauma-informed discussion on these things.
Mm,
And I still found that exact criticism. Some people didn't feel like this was super trauma-informed. I think because it lacked that disclaimer, like if you're in
mm.
these situations, it's a little more nuanced. But I would say overall, this is an incredibly accessible book around boundaries. I love it. I recommend it all the time. And as always, when you're in a really particular situation where you have any safety concerns, that's probably when you want a licensed professional to help you out.
Yeah, I think the safety piece is key and kind of goes to what you said at the start of how the author really defines like the need for boundaries or why they're there, just making you feel safe in a relationship or in your relationships, I should say. We touched on this a little bit, but what were your main takeaways from this book?
First off, there's just so many tangible examples of ways to set boundaries, things you could say. There's also vignettes that I feel like overall are pretty empathetic to both the person who wants to set the boundary as well as the recipient. I like that the author discusses the adjustment period in people respecting your boundaries in a way that doesn't villainize people for needing a moment to catch up. Because, like anything in life, you're going to need a moment. It's not going to be perfection right away. So that's where a lot of the work comes to the setter of the boundary to maintain it. But it doesn't mean you need to villainize someone for taking a little while to learn. So I really liked that both parties, I felt like, were discussed pretty empathetically. I liked that she encourages verbal communication. While there are situations where this might not be safe, sure, those might be the ones you're talking to your therapist and not reading the book about. I think when we use verbal communication, we give people the chance to change. Yes, maybe there's situations where that chance is not something worth exploring. But a lot of times, interpersonally, we operate so differently. I feel like all of our brains are like micro languages of their own. So if you're not stating something directly and explicitly, someone might not even know that a behavior is making you feel a certain way. And they might actually be really enthusiastic to change that if it's going to make the relationship better. The other two things I really liked were I don't know if she explicitly named it as discussion of boundaries with self, but there was so many discussions about boundaries outside of relationships in the traditional interpersonal realm, but boundaries with our space, boundaries with our social media, boundaries with the things that impact our health. And lastly, I liked that she normalized that boundaries change. Our lives change, our needs change. There's going to be seasons in which we could be super available, and there's going to be seasons in which we need to step back a little. And that is all okay. And normalizing discussion around that, as well as the natural ebb and flow, I thought was great.
Yeah, I really appreciated that as somebody that values their time. I mean, everyone values their time, but like you need to like sometimes block a calendar with just time that is for me to do like absolutely nothing. And I liked that this book kind of validated that thinking a little bit, just putting like boundaries around like things that were important to you personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I liked that too.
There's also like a sense of agency, right? In sort of standing up an empowered stance on finding boundaries for yourself, right? Like things aren't just happening to you without your, I don't even want to say consent, but like you in relationship, it's a lot of times it's not just things happening to you, and you do have a lot of power in shifting dynamics and with yourself too, right? I do like how the chapters broke down like work, social media, right? Family, like all the relationships. So if there
Mhm.
is that element of, I really need to look at my boundaries with work, there's a specific chapter dedicated to that, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah, I loved it. I think one of the biggest challenge areas people have around boundaries is with their phones. And this was discussed in the book, which was great. And it might not be like an interpersonal relational boundary, but it's one we have to have with ourselves. If we notice that like screen time or social media is having a really significant impact on our mental health, we need to be able to, like, I don't know what, put your phone in a drawer so you don't have to see it, but do something to change that behavior. So I really appreciated that discussion.
And each section ends with an exercise at the end of every chapter where there's kind of like practices. So I read the book and then sort of ruminated on it. Actually, I listened to the audiobook, which is why I didn't, and ruminated on it and then went back and did the exercises, which was sort of a fun thing to do after having a little bit of distance between the book. And then Amanda, I think you talked about you have the additional exercise workbook companion. Just wondering, Emma, if you have done the oh yeah, there it is. If you've done the exercises as well yourself.
You caught me. I didn't do the exercises. I did buy the book so I could look at them, but I listened to the audiobook as well. I can't remember which ones. There were some I paused to just reflect on, but I did not journal them. And if any of my, I don't think any of my clients will see this, but if any of them do, this is normalizing. We all, we all don't do our homework. And my homework to myself is going to be to do it for journal because that will be a more, I don't know. I find that when you get something out of your head and into like a journal, just process it a little differently, move through it differently. So I kind of did the exercises. I did like the grad school, like I just got to get this in my brain and figure it out version of the homework.
So we talked a little bit about how there's like each chapter is very specific in its examples, like the work, the school relationships for creating boundaries. What would your advice be for anyone that's really having trouble enforcing a boundary?
I think the three things that really stand out to me is one, go to therapy. I think all of us have our hangups where, for whatever reason, we have really big fears attached to setting boundaries. Like, what if I set this boundary and I lose my friend, I lose my connection to family, I lose connection to community? So, having someone to hold space for that and also delicately challenge it can be really helpful. I know that for me, my big boundary breakthrough came from a very trauma informed, wonderful therapist I'd worked with for years who finally gave me just a little bit more of a push. She did have to challenge me a little because we can make so many excuses for, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. And that can really get us stuck. So I think having that relational safety of this is a relationship, I see you as an empathetic human, and I'm going to challenge you to think about if this would actually be okay. It'd be really helpful. The second biggest thing I'd say is do somatic work. Boundaries are 100% somatic in our body. That's where that discomfort lives. So whether you're doing that in therapy with a somatic therapist or doing practices like yoga, meditation, or Tai Chi, all of those experiences are going to get us more able to withstand discomfort. We'll still feel it. It's still not going to be comfortable, but if we're able to be with that discomfort while also connecting to a sense of safety, that is being able to breathe, being able to feel our feet on the ground, that's going to help us in these moments because I think for a lot of us, it feels like survival. So having tools to support your nervous system in that big discomfort. And then the last thing I'd say is just do it. I know for myself, I made excuses for so many years on I can't let this person down. I can't. And as soon as I just ripped the band-aid off, thanks to the therapist who gently pushed me, who I will forever appreciate, she changed my life in the best possible way. At some point, I think for a lot of us, it's just doing it and taking the leap and hoping that the net will be there positively, but if not, trusting that we can navigate what comes next.
This is hard work, right? Like this is hard work. And I think acknowledging that I don't want to say everyone, but many people struggle with this, right? And there is discomfort in it. And letting yourself know that you can tolerate the discomfort of it, right, is also a piece that feels important, right? Because any sort of big change takes a lot of energy and does feel uncomfortable. So, I think very few people find this very easy.
Yeah. I have yet to meet someone who loves setting boundaries and just excels in it, does it casually.
Setting boundaries is very hard. And I don't know where, I don't know if I read it or saw it somewhere, but like, the idea that no is a full sentence, like I really, that always resonates with me, or that you don't have to give a lot of reasons or excuses. So I liked that this book had like literal text to be like, if you're having this problem, just say this, which was kind of helpful because it could be a way of encouraging people to learn how to reinforce them, and they wouldn't necessarily need the guide afterwards. So it was kind of helpful. But I always have to remind myself that when you're trying to set a, you don't keep having to tell people the reasons why. I often feel like a little kid. It makes it feel like a lie. The more information you're giving, you're just like, it's like a big excuse. So I'm just like, no, you can just say no.
Yeah, what I loved about the way the author created these prompts is I felt like they gave just enough information where if you are one of those people, I am, I had, especially when I first started setting boundaries, so much guilt. Like, let me tell you my whole story. Please don't hate me. In comparison, these just brief kind of sentences she had, I felt like gave just enough where if you are struggling with that desire to share a piece of your intention, it felt like it was a very contained way to do that. That wasn't necessarily opening up space for, I'm going to change my mind or this is going to be a debate.
Yeah, it's really grounding to have those very clear directions for people, I think, because boundaries can feel confusing. And what even are my boundaries? And how does my body feel in these situations? Right. I think it's nice to have very clear instruction sometimes.
Totally. And especially because they can change. And I liked that she spoke about that because I think that's where we get really confused is like maybe do a clinical boundary, right? In the summer, my schedule is really chill. So I'm a little less strict with clients around cancellations, but in the winter, I need to stick to my cancellation policy. And I'll just outright articulate that. Um, I think it's okay that our boundaries change given what's happening, given our own needs, our own circumstances.
No, that's great. I appreciate that personal example as well. In chapter 3, the author states, oftentimes poor self-care is an issue with boundaries. Can you speak to this?
I both agree with this and also wish it was put a little more delicately. Because think about it. If you are having trouble making time for yourself, you're finding yourself showing up for others instead of yourself, you're feeling resentful. All of these kind of, especially time scarcity esque components, are going to get in the way of you doing self care. Or say you're ruminating over how annoyed you were that you had to do this thing for someone else. That's going to cut into your self care. That's going to cut into the things you could do to nourish yourself. So it makes absolute sense. And yeah, again, that's the reason I wanted to do this theme is because I think it's a common thread in every single person who comes into therapy. When something's changing, you're going to need to make some changes to create space for that and figure out how to care for yourself and prioritize what's most urgent through that. It does make sense that when boundaries aren't there, that self-care goes away. Yeah, I wish it was put just a little bit more empathetically. And also, sometimes I do appreciate the direct communication because I think I know that was something for me. I could excuse away every reason I didn't have a boundary. It was always because I didn't want to let someone down. So seeing something really direct, like poor self-care is an issue with boundaries, is like, ooh, maybe I need to step back and look at it. I really appreciate that. Part of me wishes it was softer. Part of me thinks the hard-hitting nature of it is why we can really hold it and be like, whoa, let me look at this.
Totally. It's like sometimes it's like you have to hear the things that are tough to resonate with them or linger
Yeah.
on them.
Yeah.
It's so general too, right? Because, I think, well, I hope when people read this, they can apply this to their specific life and take into account socially, culturally, we're all very different. And maybe you're from a culture that is not so individualistic, right? So your self-care might look very different, or your boundaries might look very different than, someone else, your neighbor or someone in your community. And like that piece feels sort of important to talk about too, right?
Yeah,
This statement is like pretty general, right? To your point.
absolutely.
It could be phrased a little bit differently. I appreciate the sentiment, but it's quite general.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you brought that up, Amanda, because I think it's super important, right? Is there's all these cultural layers in what boundaries you might even want. It's an easy place to, let's say there is a time scarcity, to make a judgment about someone else and what they should be doing to make the most of that time. But cultural support, right? Community support, collective support is, I would say that's an aspect of self-care, right? So being open-minded to what these concepts look like for different people.
I appreciate you picking this book because personally I got a lot out of it. So I maybe like I hadn't heard of it prior to you suggesting, so I was happy to have read it. So thanks for bringing it to the forefront. And like you said, it kind of is like a little bit of a buzzword where people just throw the word boundaries out there, but it was nice to get like the substance behind, like, I don't know, just like a more thorough discussion about it.
I'm glad you liked it. I was considering a lot of books in similar topics. I feel like for Amanda, every like 3 weeks, I was like, maybe I'll actually do this book. I think just because this is such a giant thing that shows up clinically, it also hugely is part of my personal journey, figuring out how to do this work, that I really wanted to find the book that felt best for me. And of course, this won't be the book that feels best for everyone on this subject matter, but this is one I really like. I really feel comfortable recommending this to clients, just given that any self-help book is going to have its pros and cons. And overall, I think this one was one of the more empathetic and really just relatable ways of presenting this material.
So let's move on to our second book pick, which was the book of your choosing, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. Can you tell us why you picked this book?
Yeah, so I would be lying if I didn't say a huge piece was because I was listening to it at the same time as the Boundaries book. And it just worked for me. It was like, oh, this feels very kindred energy. What I really love about this book is it is also deeply somatic. And I think it's largely about boundaries and in its own way, boundaries with self, boundaries with our space, almost kind of cognitive boundaries with our mind and how we relate to objects that we have a cognitive attachment, but might not have a current physical attachment with. And also, I thought it was very, very empathetic. I really appreciate Marie Kondo's approach and the way she navigates things with just so much kindness and respect for the challenges in these processes.
Can you tell us a little bit about her KonMari method? If for people that may not have, I don't know, live under a rock and have never heard of Marie Kondo, I feel like she's been all over the place. But if anyone's not familiar with the method per se or what it actually is, would you mind explaining that?
Absolutely. And I'm sure I won't do it perfect justice. I will also give you the disclaimer. I followed the method, but not to a T. But my understanding is that essentially her process focuses on this theme of connecting with what sparks joy and letting that guide you in the process of tidying up and decluttering. She does give a lot of really like just kind of practical, here's some ways to do storage. For me, what was the most interesting thing was working with stuff, all of our literal stuff, and getting in touch with what it means to us, why we're holding on to it, and how to make our lives a little easier by letting go of things that might not be sparking joy in a way that once did. I think we can really easy. I know I just moved twice in the past 5 years, and it's wild how much stuff you accumulate. You know, when I moved in with my partner, I didn't even double check. We have like doubles of everything. Like that's not necessary. So this came to me at a really needed time when I was just kind of noticing like all of this stuff we don't need piling up. It doesn't make you feel good, right? I think if your external is cluttered, your internal can feel kind of cluttered. And the way Marie Kondo approached this process was just so empathetic. It wasn't shaming. She really discussed things like have gratitude for the time you had with these things, what they represent. And it just really, it felt very mindfulness adjacent, just like a really beautiful way to do this kind of hard work. It's hard to go through all our stuff and decide what we need to let go of.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I think, yeah, she's very much associated with the idea of objects that spark joy being the only ones that you have in your possession. Her name is sort of funny. It just like popped up to me because I work for a Canadian company that's owned by a huge Japanese company, Rakuten. And Marie Kondo was hired as our joy ambassador for a while, which
Ooh,
I don't know how I think it was more specific to like the Japanese area of the business. But for a while, we would get like a lot of emails and just be like all this Marie Kondo stuff. And I'm like, I don't really understand it because I only read the book in preparation for this. But I thought the phrase joy ambassador was like really funny. And it's kind of funny for a company to like sponsor a human. But I got a lot of joy out of that. So I guess it makes sense.
What a title.
that's
I want
great.
that title,
I know.
right?
Yeah,
Great.
what an honor.
Yeah.
I know. I don't know if she still is the official Joy Ambassador. One can only hope. But yeah, in 2019, she definitely was. So
Also, kind of a lot of pressure. Like, do I always have to exude joy? I don't know.
I guess she was cleaning up the company, something like that. But yeah, it's fun,
Nice.
fun little tidbit. And you said you moved twice recently. So I had a little bit of
Yeah.
smugness around reading this book because I just moved last year. So I'm like, ugh, I'm so great. I got rid of so much stuff. And it isn't true at all. And I did find myself using some of her methods. And I have to yeah, my to-do list is to tackle a closet that could be more organized than it currently is. Do you personally use any of Marie's methods?
Yes, so I do so, but imperfectly. So if you follow her method to a T, something she'll encourage is like you pick a category, like maybe shirt. You get every single shirt out, put them in a really big pile, and then you'll do that somatic piece. You'll hold it, you'll see if it sparks joy in your body. And I just want to say that that piece is so real. I had just such a powerful experience. I think I had like a purse that I got study abroad in Spain, right? Represents a lot of nice stuff and was something I would still wear today. And then another souvenir from this trip. And I felt nothing. And I think it was a shot glass, right? I grew out of the shot glass. I felt nothing. It didn't give me much joy, but this purse was really like full body warmth on finding it and realizing I still had this special item. So, yeah, the sparking joy thing, I'm all about. I think it's great. I would say what I do that's different is I'll just pick a region. I'll be like, okay, I'm going to go in my closet and I'm going to work on this closet today. Maybe next weekend, I'm going to look at my desk. I've actually got my partner to do it too. So that's been helpful. He's been tag teaming his various regions and then we're going to get together and do the kitchen. And that's going to be a harder one to spark joy. Cooking's kind of stressful, but we'll see how it goes if we end up with any utensils. But yeah, I like the process overall. I just shifted a little for my needs and what seems to make sense in my space. One thing I do really like is that she gives you kind of a 6 month window. She encourages you to do your whole house, but do it in a 6 month window. And that has really helped me. Like when there's not a sense of urgency, you can take your time. And that helps with like really getting in touch with that somatic response and also just not, it's like a boundary with the project, right? Like
Mhm.
instead of, I'm going to do this all in 3 weeks, like I'm going to take my time so I can still prioritize all the other things I need in my life.
I agree. It's such an embodied practice because I historically have approached it from such a disembodied place where I'm, stressed and wanting to get it done. And so I'm like hurried through things and throwing things in piles. And I did actually tackle my dresser while reading this book and tried to be a lot more intentional and found that to be very nice. But similar to you, Emma, I was like, I'm not going to pull out all the t-shirts. I'm just not. And like that, I'm going to take what works for me. I know it's encouraged to do it like in her process, but I can't do that. I can't fully align with that.
You should
And
see
so
how great my t-shirt drawer looks right now because I did pull them out and fold them.
I know it's so impressive once you like it's aesthetically so pleasing when you're like folding the way like it's so beautiful. I'm like, how long will this
Yeah,
last?
it's not super practical if you're like pulling out like four things and trying on a bunch of stuff. It's, I only did it a week ago, so we'll see.
She says once you do the method, you're good. So we'll see.
We'll have to circle back maybe in like a year to see where we're all at with
Yeah.
our t-shirt
Yeah, like
drawers
a month,
then.
a month. Give us a month, I'd say.
So Emma, what connection do you make between boundaries and the art of tidying up?
It's all about comfort with discomfort and behavioral activation. And I think that's the thing in therapy is like we can understand our stuff, we can feel it. At some point, usually there are some changes we need to make. This is all about, right, the discomfort of attachment, really, right? Like the attachment we have to various things, sitting in that detachment, and then figuring out where can I manage the comfort with this discomfort to create the boundaries I need around my house. I mean, I had a pretty significant back injury this spring. And if I'm totally honest, I think a lot of it came from my storage spaces not being in great space. So when we think about things like that in terms of boundaries with self, like that's a pretty important one. Like I'm going to create storage in a way that is ergonomic for my body and I won't throw my back out again. I don't know. To me, this is very much boundary work, boundaries with ourselves, boundaries with our space. And I do think it has such a positive mental health component when we do these practices.
That's interesting to think about. In your case, maybe a back injury from moving in a certain way to get something based on clutter or yeah, I think that that piece is really interesting and important and one that we don't think about very often unless you're faced with something
Yeah.
like an injury where you're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
wow, like how did this happen?" Right? "Oh, was it because I had to like tweak my back to get to something, right? And what would that have
Yeah.
been if the space had been a little different?"
Yeah, totally.
So, does sparking joy lead to finding peace? Can we make that
I
connection here?
think it helps. I don't think it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. Yeah, I think maybe hard to draw that exact correlation, but maybe helpful in finding that sort of contentment.
Maybe sparking joy plus boundaries leads to peace. Maybe it's these two books. I don't know. Folks will need to report back. We might need a few more books.
Maybe some listeners can weigh in on that and
Yeah.
let us know.
Yeah.
This book touches on memories and nostalgia with physical objects, encouraging people to take stock of themselves more than a physical object. What are your thoughts on this? And you kind of spoke to this a little bit with your purse, but curious if you have any other thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, this was one of my favorite parts of the book because, yeah, I'll share. I have a collection of shot glasses from when I studied abroad. I have no use for shot glasses in the current chapter of my life. It does not represent my hobbies, my interests, what I like to do. But I was holding on to them, right? Because it would be like, oh, I got this in Madrid or whatever that may be. So it was actually so helpful to find other things of nostalgia and feel that shift in my body. Like, oh
Mm,
no, this thing that I'll actually still use feels like I feel my heart warm up versus shot glass, I don't feel anything. And other aspects, there were not as many, but there were some nostalgic things that I don't use that did spark joy. And I felt really at peace keeping them. I think the example I liked most, it's kind of nostalgia. It's a little different. And Amanda, I'd love to know how this one struck you. But she spoke about seminar notes and how we hold on to seminar notes. And I was literally in my office looking at a stack this big of grad school readers that I have not opened once since grad school ended, Most of them are going to be a little outdated now. That was a while ago. We're looking at
Hmm.
things differently. And she spoke about how people often will hold on to seminar notes as a representation of what they learned. And then you'll never open it again, right? And that was like a light bulb moment for me.
Hmm.
Like, okay, I can throw away this like 40 pounds of readers that I have not opened since I finished grad school. I can trust that there's always new resources coming out, and that's going to be where I'm headed, looking for current information in my field. And I can trust that I learned enough in grad school that that will not disappear if I get rid of these books. And yeah, I think that gratitude piece really like helps in that, like, oh, I can appreciate what I did learn, and now I can let it go.
That's so real. I agree. I'm the same. I have stacks of trainings or seminars or readers that, sometimes I actually will open it and flip to a page and just see um what's there. And that's kind of fun because sometimes I feel it's like I'm being transported back to that time a little bit in my body, like remembering it maybe when I read it the first time and my understanding of it. So I do like that piece, but that's not like a regular practice where it would be necessary for me to keep, 25 readers. And so, yeah, that part also struck me. I was like, I feel a little bit called out, and that's okay. That being said, I still feel like I can't part with a lot of my books. I know that's like another piece that she talks about is getting rid of books, and I don't like it. I like to have full bookshelves. I like having access to them. So, I think take or leave the pieces that work for you, like anything, right? But that was a piece I was kind of like, no, I'm keeping my books. But I did really like the piece about pictures and
Mm.
maybe looking through the mounds of pictures. I have so many pictures from high school where I was really into like, we had our digital cameras in college and then we had, whatever we were using in high school. We didn't have phones like we do now. So it's like I have mounds of pictures, and she had suggested maybe keeping one picture from that event, right? If you have 500 pictures from like a certain event in high school, like maybe find the one that sparks the most joy. And I really did appreciate that piece. I was like, I can get behind this. So, take what you want and leave what you would like to as well.
I kept my books too. Maybe it's a therapist thing. The ones I actually read, I like to reference, and you two are on a books podcast, so there's probably some joy there.
Yeah. I'm like, it's for work, Marie.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I'm a digital book employee, so I shouldn't have this. Don't look, don't look. Uh, but the photo thing I thought was interesting because I was thinking about it in like the digital sense because I feel like I used to be so nostalgic or like maybe like a little bit too attached to like old digital photos. And one time, I think currently now, one of my hard drives just isn't working, or there's a period where I guess before the iPhone backup was what it is now and much easier, didn't work, and I lost a bunch of stuff. And the world didn't end. I continued living and it wasn't that big a deal. So it always strikes me whenever I use an iPhone and whenever I have to go to the Apple store to repair something, they're always like, did you back up your photos? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like if they're gone, they're gone, they're not as
Mm,
obviously some photos are important, but I'm trying really not to be as attached to them. But the fact that they really asked that question quite forcefully, I'm like, oh, you must have had like a lot of fights in the store about like photos being missing and things like that. So yeah, the not being so attached to nostalgia was a good kind of reminder.
mm.
Mhm.
One interesting piece, and we've touched on this, I think, a few times around permission giving, around allowing your own boundaries to change. When I was thinking about Marie Kondo, I had remembered like a bit of media around after she had children. And her quote was she had kind of given up trying to keep her house tidy, but still tries to declutter things in her life that distract her from her children. And this might be surprising to those that read her books and followed her a few years ago, but I see it as a woman who's redefined her values and in turn her boundaries. What are your thoughts on this?
I loved it. And it's funny because you had mentioned this was a question that might come up. And literally the same morning, I saw an article discussing this on Google and in my For You page. And I was so excited about it because I love the Marie Kondo book and it wasn't a perfect fit for me. There were certain things where I was like, I'm not going to do that. That doesn't make sense for me. I feel okay about it. And it was just so really, to me, it kind of felt, like the full circle moment between these two books to see her say, I'm not like fully giving things up, but my life's changed. So what sparks joy has changed. And that's kind of leading these adjustments on where I can have, I don't even want to say more porous boundaries, but where I can change my boundaries, right? Where things can be a little more flexible. And I think that's, to me, so much of what I loved about the first book, because I think a lot of boundary discussions don't normalize that needs change, boundaries change. And I thought it was amazing too that she's publicly stating that. Like, I hope that gives people more permission to be flexible, to take inventory in different times in your life, different needs. And it's okay if you had a hard stance on something at one point and your life changes and doesn't fit anymore. So to me, when I saw that, it was just like, it felt really good in my body. It felt very like, if these two authors had like met and influenced each other, I hope this is what would have happened.
Yeah, it's so great. It's so, like you said, permission giving, and also, I think a signal to people that maybe there's something you've tolerated in a relationship, from work, from family, within yourself, that you no longer want to tolerate. And that's when you can change. That's when you can set a different boundary for yourself. So I know I was like so excited because when we were thinking about this book, I was like, I swear there was a quote about this. I remember this. So yeah, I'm also glad that she was so public in that. Emma, thank you so much for chatting with us today. If you're open, where can people sort of find you online, either some sort of social media handle or website? Any folks in Oregon that would be interested in working with you?
Again, my name's Emma Stern. I'm an LPC in Oregon. My website is www.metamorphosispdx.com. My email is emma@metamorphosispdx.com. And then I still do trauma-informed yoga. Right now, I've made a lot of boundaries with myself. So it's just online once a week. That wouldn't be appropriate for current therapy clients, but that is something if folks are looking for a somatic practice, get into their body, work on relationship with discomfort, as we've spoken of. So for that, you can find me at www.emmasternSomatics.com. And I'm currently on a social media hiatus, which has been wonderful. In theory, if I'm back, it'll be Emma Stern Somatics. I have a feeling I won't be, that I'll only be doing private, hidden under the ground social media, because we got to love our self-boundaries. But I would be delighted if anyone reached out to me through any of those other platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Thank you for having me. This is really nice to, reconnect with you, Amanda, meet you, Tara, and talk about these books.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with any of your own recommendations, or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Happy finding peace through boundary setting.